Well, we have arrived at our last panel of the day, and I think for those of you who have been with us all day, or if you are just joining us now, you will find this to be a very engaging panel that raises a lot of possibly new ideas for you, but really looking at issues around changes in technology and what do we need to pay attention to as mine technologies change? How does this change how companies and communities relate to one another? So we'll hear about how some old technologies can be very helpful, as well as new technologies and the challenges and opportunities with technological advancement. And after this panel, we'll have a live conversation, so stick around. We'll talk with Flaviano Bianchini and Trevor Jones, and representing the New Tech New Deal projects and the Intergovernmental Forum I just referenced. We'll also have Aaron Cosby, who is a senior associate with the Intergovernmental Forum and also with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. So again, a reminder to please keep posting questions. We love this engagement with you. We want to make sure we respond to the questions you have. So please keep those good questions and comments coming in.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this session of the University of Arizona Mining Law Summit. Today, we are going to be talking about the use of technology, social media, and research on the impacts of new mine technologies to respond to community concerns. And we are so excited to have our panelists here today. First, we have Flaviano Bianchini, who is the founder and executive director of Source International, an organization that brings capacity building and scientific support to communities who face human rights and environmental issues with a focus on the extractives industries. Flaviano's work with Source International has focused on projects in Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Mongolia, Indonesia, Mozambique, India, and beyond. Source International projects often involve use of innovative, affordable technologies and trainings for communities to aid in community measurements of air and water quality and documentation of findings. Next, we have with us today Trevor Jones, who is the founder and CEO of Lynx Global Intelligence, a software as a service platform that provides risk data to companies and investors. His background includes research focusing on geopolitical risk and complex decision-making during humanitarian crisis. Lynx Global Intelligence helps clients on 3 continents mitigate risk to people and planet. And finally, here we have Isabel Ramdu, who is Deputy Director with the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals, and Sustainable Development, and the International Institute for Sustainable Development Law and Policy Program. She provides strategic support to IGF member countries to optimize socioeconomic benefits from the mining sector. Thanks so much for being with us today.
So we'll kick off this panel with an interview with Flaviano, and then we'll continue the discussion with Isabel and Trevor and get some of their reflections on our conversation with Flaviano. Flaviano, please give us a brief overview of how Source International uses technology to respond to community concerns in the mining sector.
Well, first of all, I mean, I think I should start a bit with my story somehow. So when I start working with communities affected by mining, what I realized that very often there was a complete lack of understanding between the mining companies, the community, and the government. And this is mostly because it was historical mistrust. Just bear in mind that I started working in Latin America, where the mining industry and the government has an historical mistrust with communities. And there was also a lack of knowledge. So it was easy for everybody to just pick whatever subject because the community didn't really know what was happening inside their territories. Imagine you're an indigenous community in the middle of the Amazon forest, and all of a sudden you have an open pit mine inside your territory. You have no idea what is that, and obviously you have no tools to know what is happening exactly to your territory, to your environment. And that's how Source International starts, with the idea of providing those communities with instruments, knowledge, and tools that they can use to understand what is happening inside their territories, to measure somehow the impact that mining can have on their communities, and from that ask for better behavior from companies, compensation from governments or companies, and the respect of their rights, basically. During the year, we have developed several instruments and tools. The vast majority of them are very easy and basic, and even somehow old technologies, I would say. The point is not that much the innovative technology, is the innovative aspect is to give technology to people that never had access to that technology. Even a very simple pH meter, an instrument that measures the acidity of the water, that is being invented in the 20s, so a century ago, in the 20s of last century. Even an instrument like that, which is super simple, and today people use it to measure the pH of their pool in their villas, but that's something that an indigenous community had never seen before, and they don't know how to use it, and they don't know what information that instrument can give to them. But that instrument, a simple instrument of $20 that people use to measure their pool, can be used to measure acid rock drainage, which is one of the main polluting aspects of mining, for example. And then, I mean, obviously, this is the most simple example, and we also use some more sophisticated instruments, but generally, I think the innovative aspect is to provide communities with this technology. And therefore, the community can know what is happening inside their territories, and use this data that they have to open a dialogue with companies and mining companies, sorry, and with governments. And even if it sounds very simple, it is actually very simple, but it can have a huge effect, because imagine the situation of a community that doesn't have any access to information, and therefore the mining company can tell them that they are the best all over the world, even if they are polluting, and the government can tell them whatever, and they don't really know. But if they have the access to this technology, they can measure what is happening. And from there, they can start negotiating, they can start demanding and asking for the respect of their rights. And we have examples of community in Mexico where they were able to obtain $50 million compensation from a mining company because they were able to measure scientifically the pollution that this company was causing. And I think this aspect on the long run, it's even more powerful, because if we can create a world where all the communities can monitor all the companies inside their territories, then companies will be somehow forced and driven to behave differently, to respect communities.
Thank you. Are there any other examples of the projects that Source International has done that have effectively utilized technology to advance community objectives?
Oh yes, there are many. In Peru, for example, in the city of Cerro de Pasco, we have obtained a declaration of emergency, of environmental emergency of the city, and the first time, and then the declaration of health emergency of the city. We're talking about a city of 80,000 inhabitants, and there are remedies that is put in place after this declaration, and also like funds from the government in this case, to enable to mitigate the impact that the pollution was causing on the people of the city. And in that case, we have been using some bit more sophisticated technology too. We have been measuring also the dust with some small laser detection. We have done some also infrared analysis from satellite images. So I mean, it's not always super simple, but I mean, there are plenty of cases in which they were the community itself able to measure and obtain therefore compensation or remedies. In Mozambique, we have been installed all around the small villages close to a coal mine. We have been installed a series of instruments to measure the PM10 and PM2.5, so the coal dust pollution from the mine, and we have been able to open up a negotiation table between the mining company and the community with the participation of the government and the United Nations in that case as a mitigator. In that case, we have been combining these instruments that are actually a bit complicated with laser measuring precisely the PM10 and PM2.5 with a very simple community mapping, which is a small disc of cotton where we have put Vaseline on top, so the coal dust just get glued to it. So we put those discs all in the same days all around the community at different distances from the mine, and then a month later we just took pictures of all those places, and we measure where the coal deposit more and where less, which is obviously not high technology, but it's something that a community can do, and for 0.12 cents of dollar. That was the average price of the entire for every measurement plate. So even a farmer community in Mozambique was able to do it.
Thank you for those examples.
Great, thank you so much, Flaviano. And looking at these technologies that you've been referencing and speaking about, we are seeing mining companies bring on new innovative technologies that may have positive benefits, such as decreased water use and lower carbon emissions, and others, such as advances in automation, that may increase efficiency and increase worker safety, but it may also drastically reduce the need for a local workforce. What have you heard from communities where you've worked with Source International about changes in mining technology and the impacts on their lives and communities?
This is a very difficult question. I mean, that's a difficult answer, actually. There is, as you said, there are mining that, especially the old mining, the old mines that has been reconverted with new technologies, where local communities were used to have 6,000 or 7,000 employees, and now they have 300. And of which 150 are engineers, so not from the community. And that obviously, it creates a lot of concern because those communities need those jobs. But at the same time, I think it should be, there should be a transition into the economy too. So those new technology that the mine is using to extract, they can use more workforce to reduce pollution, for example, for mitigation, and obviously there's also the concern of pollution in the community. So it's a balance somehow. And in theory, what I think is that for those old mines, the money that they have generated when there were a lot of employees, they should now be used either by the government or by the company itself to redesign new jobs, basically, possibly in different sectors, so also diversified economies, because it's not 100% sure that having 6,000 employees on a 30,000 inhabitants community is good for the economy. Actually, it might get a boost at the beginning, but then it's very fragile. And especially because they are pretty much linked to the price of raw material, that they can fluctuate quite a lot. In terms of new technology, there is also, I think, it's true, mining companies are reducing pollution in a lot of cases. It's not always the case all over the world. This is something that might be mentioned, because what those new technologies can be used in the United States, in Canada, and Europe, they are not used then in Mozambique, in Guatemala, or in Mongolia. A clear example is, for example, copper extraction, which in the United States is mostly now there's a growing extraction system with bacteria, but if you go to Latin America, they're still using sulfuric acid, which it's highly pollutant. Same with the new technology of closed cyanide for gold extraction. So the closed cyanide process are now a law in Europe and in the United States and Canada. But then if you go to Guatemala, all the gold mines of Guatemala, which are quite a lot, they use open cyanide. And there is a balance, because most of the companies and most of the people say, well, we respect laws. I mean, the government does not oblige us to use a closed mechanism. So, I mean, we comply with local law. And I remember I was in quite a few times ago in a conference in Miami with Kofi Annan, and Kofi Annan said, a mining company doesn't need a law to know that they don't have to pollute the water of the village. So I think, and this is something that also should be considered, like new technologies that are available and that are used by companies, they must be used all over the world, even if the law does not require it. This, I think, is something that we should move in that direction.
Thank you so much for that, Flaviano. I think that you're absolutely right, that it's time to be more strategic about this transition that we're looking at and making sure that we are integrating those long-term benefits into the communities with these mining projects. So thank you.
Flaviano, what types of technologies, whether it's scientific or communications or social media, do you think would most advance the objectives of communities as they navigate the impacts and benefits of mines?
I think it's pretty much everything. They definitely need technology to measure pollution. As I said before, they need to have tools to know what is happening inside their territories. They also need tools to communicate it, because what I always say, if you have data, but you cannot communicate those data to anybody, then those data are useless. And in that sense, it can be, social media can be, but I don't think social media is the panacea of everything. And actually, in a lot of cases, doesn't really work very effectively. In remote communities, for example, community radios are still pretty much way more effective than social media. If you go in the middle of the forest, the radio is the main communication tool. So there is something that I would say not everybody, but the majority of people are now having is a mobile phone. It's a smartphone. So we have been trying to work, for example, in using the smartphone as a measuring tool. So developing some app or something like that to use your smartphone in order to measure the pollution of the water somehow. It won't be super precise, but something that can work. The problem is that obviously apps need a market to be developed, because you need to pay to do the apps, to the engineers, the informatics, and everything. And there's no market for those things, because obviously if the app would be a paid app, nobody will buy, and nobody will never put advertisement on an app for measuring water pollution. I think there is a potential there. So if I would have invested now, I think that's probably I think it's the sector that I think is still, it is useful, but at the same time, it's not as much developed as it could be. Because in terms of like proper analytical technology, we have plenty. I mean, plenty. We have been to the moon 60 years ago, and what's the problem of measuring water pollution? We were able to do that 150 years ago. There's plenty of technology and cheap technology. So the point is to put this technology in the right hands. And in terms of communication, it's not always easy. And the problem with social media is that there is a lot of noise. Noise as a scientific terms of noise. So when you have a lot of background noise, and then you cannot really hear what is important. So it's hard sometimes to just put out the news. But there is from traditional media also there is a bit of more attention, a bit more focus recently over those issues. So I think there is improvement also there.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Ashley to wrap us up.
Yes, absolutely. So, in these last few moments here, Flaviano, you mentioned radios and other communication challenges that may arise in remote communities. In this era of COVID-19 and seeing the huge shift to online virtual meetings, but often not having an accessible platform for remote communities near mineral developments, how has your work continued to work with communities through this pandemic to address some of those issues? Thank you.
It has been hard, and you're totally right. It's not easy to communicate with local communities. They don't have a proper connection. They don't have 4G, 5Gs, or a Wi-Fi connection, and it's super hard to keep the communication from remote. For us, we are trying to communicate mostly with the leaders of the community that normally they have a smartphone and maybe they can connect to Zoom or to any other platform, and then try to empower them to then work more with the community. But it's very hard. We were used to work directly with the community, and it's a completely different thing. And it's also very difficult for us because all the measurements, it's hard to explain. I have an instrument and I have to teach you how to use the instrument. I'm there and give you the instrument, and it's easy. If I'm here and try to explain you with the same instrument from the computer with maybe a connection with very low quality of video and that maybe breaks every 2 minutes, it's super hard. But that's what we have to do so far, and just hanging on for better moments, I assume.
Great. And over to Christy for any closing comments.
Well, I think in closing, is there any key guidance that you would offer to mining companies and other stakeholders who are participating today that are takeaways from Source International's work to use technology to support communities?
I think if I have to say one takeaway, one guidance is engage the community. Engage them, and citizen science is a big issue. Is actually there is a movement to add the citizen science as one of the sustainable development goals, to just bring it as important as it is, and just engage them, do citizen science, build the capacity, because that what will open the table for dialogue. That will open the mutual understanding of all the actors, which are mainly 3: governments, companies, and communities, and start the conversation. Unfortunately, very often we see that of those 3 actors, there is company and government speaking by them and keeping the community outside. and it's awful, because also then what the reaction of the community that feel excluded is very often a confrontive reaction, obviously, and that what happens is that they rise up and conflicts generation and all the problem that can generate from that.
Well, thank you so much for taking time to share your experience and expertise and the work of Source International. We really appreciate it.
Thanks
Thank
to
you,
all of
Fabiana.
you. Thank
You're
you.
most welcome. Okay, well, a lot of topics came up in that very informative video conversation with Flaviano. And I'm wondering, Isabel and Trevor, what are your initial reactions to the information that Flaviano shared and the experience of Source International?
I think this was absolutely fascinating. I mean, to me, it really underscores the power of knowledge and the power of sharing that knowledge. And I think data, new technologies, is really taking the conversation to a different level. I think 5-10 years ago, we would have kind of expected things to come, like we say, through the grapevine. And now this is real-time information, real-time data. It's evidence-based, and it's very hard to go around it if people are informed. I think this is really important, the power of knowledge, the power of information, and the power of making this information known and using it. I think to me, this is what I really got from that conversation. I found it really interesting. And I think a lot of what he said will probably come up in the comments that we will make, but just one thing I wanted to highlight is the last point he talked about partnerships and how you engage with communities and the way you engage with communities. I think it's kind of flipping the conversation over to what previously people were calling it a paternalistic conversation, where mining will tell communities what to do or will think for the communities. And now the fact that the communities have some of that information, the conversation becomes much more, I don't want to say balanced, because there is, the power relation is still very skewed, but you kind of see that data and information is bringing this balance a little bit less skewed than what it was.
Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah,
Trevor,
absolutely.
any thoughts you'd like to add?
Yeah, absolutely. We talk a lot about at Links about the empathic space in between the companies and the community, right? And so you can tell by the way Flaviano talks about some of these things that he's been on the ground with the communities in that kind of space between enterprise and what's going on socially and environmentally. And I definitely have some comments a little bit downstream about some of the technologies he mentioned and really how to aggregate them into one platform so we can kind of give both the community and the company the tools they need to kind of create that space in between. And I think it was interesting that, he said that the app needs a market. And if you look at the market, I mean, the mining companies, like you said, Isabel, they're big and powerful. They got a lot of money. So, they are the market for this technology. And so if you can get them to create this space with that technology, it's just really cool. So I have a deep respect for what his company's doing. And oh my gosh, the innovation with the Vaseline and the coal dust, that's a sensor we never would have thought of at Lynx. So very, very cool.
Yeah,
stuff.
sometimes the best technologies for communities can be the most simple.
Yeah, absolutely. And, he mentioned how cheap some of these sensors are, right? So there really is no cost prohibition to going around a Peru or a Mozambique, putting some of these sensors in the ground and then giving that info to who needs it. So it's cool stuff, deep respect for his work. I can't wait to reach out to him to understand too how they're tackling some of these things.
Great.
Thank you so much, Isabel and Trevor, for those insights there. Trevor, we'd love to hear more about your work. Please give us a brief overview of how Lynx Global collects and uses publicly available data, including from social media sources, to monitor risks to a mining company's social license to operate, which we all know is a big trending topic these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Flaviano mentioned, it's kind of about connecting those environmental grievances and measuring the ground truth of what's going on to that social license and kind of the behaviors and perceptions and side communities, so we can try and create that buy-in and a lot of security and human dignity for people. But the way we try to go about that is really as a data aggregator. So we quickly realized that rather than running around the world, putting sensors in the ground and kind of creating data, that there's plenty of data around us at all times for all of these problem sets. And so what we do is we essentially create a weighted algorithm for social license, and it takes into account things like security, which, in Mozambique, for example, really kind of nascent emergent security issues, a lot of terrorism that has come about even just in the last year, right? So we want to make sure that we're getting that security data kind of as a base level. Hard to create economic prosperity and human dignity when there's no security, right? So then we move on to the social piece, where we're gathering from social media and actually working on some of the same data sets that Flaviano mentioned. So the SMS text, right? Not everybody in the world has a computer and an internet connection, but almost everybody has a phone right in their hand, whether that's a smartphone or a dumb phone, right? So we can kind of send those SMS surveys out and start to take a look at that piece. So the way social media, I will say, comes into play is when these social issues snowball into a global reputational issue. And we've seen that for some of our clients. And honestly, that's great incentive to kind of get that company leg of that three-legged stool to kind of pay attention to some of the reputational issues and stemming from social license. So it really is just an amalgamation or aggregation of open source data sets that come from institutions, academia, social media data sets, news, blogs, Reddit, YouTube, certainly working on the local radio issue, because tons of opportunity in terms of translating into English and then into text and then disseminating that information amongst stakeholders. And so, we have 4 or 5 kind of subcategories we pull from. The last one I'll mention is kind of new data sets like satellite, GPS for trucks. We mentioned dust coming off the trucks and communities as well. And then Internet of Things would be the final one, the sensors in the ground. So it's a wide range of data sets, but that's really the point, is to collect and aggregate this info so it's super usable and easy to understand for both the community and the enterprise.
Fantastic. And you've already touched on this a bit. Can you provide us with some examples of how mining companies in particular have used the data from your platform to identify and then respond to community concerns?
Sure, I'll use a high-level example, and of course I have to be a bit general because of the sensitivities, right, frankly, between the community and the enterprise in a lot of these situations, particularly the community, of course. But in Eastern Europe, we had a situation where one of our clients had a $200 million investment and kind of a well-known mine and an older operation. And this was in an area where it had been a Soviet spa town. The respect for the water purity in this area and a lot of the other environmental factors was really, really high. And as it turned out, our client had done a lot of stakeholder engagement, a lot of kind of interaction with the community. But we were able to use our technology to kind of trace some of those grievance strains, right, down to what the individual grievances were. And certainly the water piece was huge. And we also find out things like livestock, right, where herders are able to put their cows when mining concessions or, exploration comes in. These little things, right, can trickle or snowball, I should say, into really large grievances. And this particular mine suffered some pretty significant reputational risk and discontinuity issues as a result. So that's a lose-lose for everybody, right? So, again, create that empathic space, get the data, and represent it in a way that both the community and the companies can understand and use to try and help out.
Great. Thanks, Trevor.
Thank you.
Isabel, let's turn to your fascinating research on the topic of mining technology. Please tell us more about the New Tech, New Deal project and its approach to understanding impacts of new mining technologies on sustainable development.
Yeah, thanks. This is indeed a really fascinating stream of work that has kind of grown out organically from one of our annual general meetings we had a couple of years ago. At that meeting, we were discussing a number of issues, and we had discussions going on in parallel rooms, right? In one room, there was a great discussion about a document that I was involved in. Like, we had a guidance document on local content policies, and governments were talking about how best to design local content strategies and policies to get the most of employment and jobs and the most of procurement and to add value downstream. So the discussion was really focused on, how can you get the most out of policies? How can you design policies? At the same time, in another room, there was another extremely fascinating discussion, this time led by industries. And the conversation there was about the new technologies that were being deployed to make the mines greener, smarter, more efficient. And the discussion was about trends in innovation and how that would change the face of the mines in the next couple of years. What struck us in those two conversations were the disconnect between them. While governments were busy designing nice, fancy policies, regulatory frameworks to mandate, basically to force companies to recruit more local people, to buy more local goods and services, they were completely missing the fact that the industry was changing, that some of the technologies would completely wipe out the jobs that they were forcing companies to recruit. And the same for procurement. And they were also really missing the fact that that was happening super fast. So, Flaviano was mentioning something earlier. He said, yeah, but we see those technologies coming very fast in Canada. Today, the first fully turnkey automated project happened in Mali. Among all places. And there is another one by the same company in DRC. So this is not something that is a fiction for developing countries. It is real. And many governments actually don't really realize that. That was the first thing. The second thing on the other side, similarly, the industry was busy talking about fantastic processes, how to improve them, how to make them more efficient, more competitive. And of course, if you don't do this, you go out of business. But they were not speaking to public authorities, and they were not telling to public authorities what kinds of skills they will need, because jobs, not all the jobs will disappear. I mean, there will still be opportunities, but the opportunities will be completely different. The kind of jobs that you have today in low-income countries is relatively low skill. The opportunities, at least at the mine phase, what the new mines will require is something completely different. And you need to manage this transition from one to the other, because technology won't happen at the same time, at the same space across all economic sectors. So in developing countries, what the mine is able to do, maybe the manufacturing sector or the ag sector is not doing at the same pace. It will happen, but it's not all kind of sync. So there is a need to do this transition. So this is how our project came about. So we realized there was a big gap to be filled there because the governments were setting themselves up for failure if they didn't understand what trends were coming up and designing policies that would work, not work. And there would be frustration there because the more they think it's not working, the more they try to regulate and the more they impose penalties. And that's what you see now in local content policies. And companies were setting themselves up also for disaster because they were not speaking to governments. And flip side is that at their face, they have communities being super, anxious about the future of their jobs because they don't know what will happen. There's no training, there's no reskilling, there's no plans. So that kind of two things we needed. IGF IGF, part of the work that we do, we provide guidance to government, but we also facilitate the conversation among various types of stakeholders to try to find an approach for things to improve. So that's how the project started. And we started with the first report that really basically tried to understand. The report was called Mining a Mirage. So basically what we looked at is we reassessed the shared value paradigm to try to find, in light of new technologies, what would happen. And it was relatively narrow, if you want, because it was a first assessment. We focused on automation and we focused on jobs. And we kind of created scenarios, a 30% cut in employment, 50% and 70%, and try to kind of simulate what could happen. None of that was based on evidence data from companies. It was hypothetical scenarios just for governments to understand, if you don't do this, what could happen? And then, of course, that was the first kick in the door, and it was scary, and people we got really a lot of questions from people saying, yeah, but we really need to get evidence out of this. And then we decided to go deeper, and that's where we are now. We have a 2-year project that is funded by GIZ that is this time trying to go deeper to understand what technologies are really coming in a broad sense. What we did in the first phase of this work, we mapped the technologies coming to really understand, because if you want to understand the impact, you have to understand what you're talking about. There are different types of technologies. Some might be positive. We were talking about sensors, data-driven technologies, and there are things like automation. Impact is completely different. You've got things like green technology that can be really enhancing if local communities have access to green energy, to water, etc. So there are some. So what we did, we mapped them, we categorized them in 5 groups, a taxonomy, and then we looked at what impact those technologies would have on things like gender, things like jobs. So of course, the study kind of looks at impact on really context specifically. We didn't want to put a number this time because the numbers don't really make sense. Things change so fast that the number become completely irrelevant. What we try to understand is, how do you do this when those changes happen? So yeah, the report is available online, and it provides you with a kind of good mapping of what is coming up, what are the potential impact. We indeed focused a lot on skills and the skills of the future, because that came out as something particularly striking when it comes to the impact at the local level. It's jobs and it's procurement. The other things are important, but in the short to medium term, those were the main issues that we looked at. And we also looked at how can you think about social investments in a more innovative way, just to use the word technology, but to think differently, things like the way you look at CSR strategies they are now. I think to me, this is a bit of a stale model, because it looks at things. CSR is cyclical. The first thing that gets cut when the price of commodities go down is the CSR budget. What is left is the little crumbs that you can get. What we're trying to see whether we are able to build in a little bit what the ESG debate is about, building more impact right from the start when you design an investment project, when you're designing it, or if you're already in operation phase, how do you rethink your social investment to drive more impact? It's more sustainable, it's a more virtuous model, and it kind of brings in the community to the table when you discuss and negotiate that. So we looked a bit at a very first cut at those kind of things. And now in the second phase, we're going deeper. We're doing 5 case studies. We're looking at South Africa, DR Congo, Burkina Faso, Chile, and Mongolia. And we're getting deeper into those country-specific realities, and see how we can, what we can learn from this, so that governments can improve their policies moving forward. So that's where we are in terms of the analysis and the study.
Terrific. I'm wondering if your study has any key findings about how advances in automation may increase opportunities for women in the mining sector and help advance gender equality. Does your research support this?
Yeah, so of course, when you look, I just wanted to say that when we glance, I don't want to see look in this particular phase, because this is something we're doing now. When we glance at the gender impact, we actually realize that men will be more affected than women, because they're in larger number, right? So because they are larger share, they will be more impacted, and because they're employed in physical and manual jobs, that will disappear. Whereas the women that we have today in the industry, they are more at the administrative level, they're in the office, not necessarily at the mine phase. Their jobs are also at risk, but those are jobs that you could, I don't want to use the word easy because there's no easy transition, but administrative jobs are more easily transferable elsewhere in other economic sectors. an accountant that gets wiped out because of blockchain can become an accountant in an SME that is still there. So that is one thing that kind of struck us in the structure of the way the gender balance is in the industry at that particular moment. That said, you're right, there will be new opportunities with new technologies for women. The major issue that we had, and those will probably be in higher skill position and, in HQs, in more modern operating, remote operations in capital cities, not necessarily at the mine phase. The main challenge that we face there is data. There's no data. So we have no idea today how many women are employed in the large scale mining sector. Our project don't focus on ASM, it focuses in large scale. Very hard to get a clear exact numbers of how many women are employed, except from some anecdotal evidence from countries like South Africa, Australia, Canada. Even the ILO doesn't have any detailed background breakdown of direct employment of women at the mine, let alone if you want to look at it from a supply chain perspective. How many women own a business to supply the mine or work in a sector that supply the mine? Zero. Data doesn't exist at breakdown level. And neither are they by occupation or by country. So this was super hard, to try to see what will happen next if you don't know what the state of play is. The other thing that was hard to get is assessment of the conditions of work and salaries. We know very well that, high level, that the salaries are not the same. How much? We have no clue. So all this to say that we are now working on a new research work stream with International Women in Mining, Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment, the ILO, and other stakeholders who are able to provide us with this baseline analysis. Because as long as you don't understand what the state of play is, you are not able to project yourself in the future. Yes, there are opportunities, we know high level, but I cannot tell you now, looking at what the technologies are coming, what those opportunities will be, and how can you empower them? What are the skills? We don't know what is the skills gap today for mining jobs for women at the mine site. We have no idea. So just to say that, yeah, this is really a critical issue that we'll be looking at. And I think if everything goes well, by sometimes mid next year, we should have some findings, and then we will map that with the work that we're doing on the future of technology.
Thank you so much, Isabel.
Thank you, Isabel. I love hearing that you guys are doing all this work on gender equality and getting those really accurate data sets. So thank you guys for all that. And we're looking forward to seeing the results of the study. Now here's a question for you both. As we asked Flaviano earlier, what types of new technologies in science, social media, communications, or otherwise, do you think would best advance the objectives of communities as they navigate the impacts and the benefits of mines?
Yeah, Isabel, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can. I think Flaviano said very clearly, it's a bunch of different types of technologies. I think it's not just one technology. What really, there are some obvious one, of course, when you look at high-speed connectivity, digital infrastructure, clean technologies. Those are obvious technologies that can have direct impact on communities. But I think there are others that are less obvious. And I think that those that have multiple uses are, to me, the ones that are the most interesting to look at. We talk about things like sensor technologies. You were talking, Trevor, about apps and connected. Things like this have wider application. What we've seen, for example, when we were looking at alternative livelihoods, because one of the challenge of doing the transition away from large number of jobs, or relatively large number of jobs, because mines are capital intensive, but for communities it matters, right? So if you're moving from 3,000 jobs to 5,000 jobs, what do you do with 2,500 people? You need to find an alternative livelihood. And very often this will not be in the mine, it has to be somewhere else. So the technology challenge, actually, that seems a challenge for communities. Some of those can actually be part of the solution for them. if you are able to provide them to other economic sectors. You were talking about livestock. We've seen, for example, in countries like Kenya, people were using their apps to look at the weather forecast and look at the commodity prices on the stock market for livestock. And they are able to plan their agricultural practices. The other thing that is very important, I think Flaviano was referring to this, is those technologies that are able to get you pH of water and quality of air, quality, the temperature. This is very powerful if you're able to map that with agriculture or some other economic activities. You can plan your season, agricultural season, if you know how some of those things look like. And to me, this is what is interesting. How do you adapt some of those same drones, for example? You're able to use a drone to bring blood to a hospital 200 kilometers away just because the drone flies straight and there's no road, right? And those things, the industry are buying them. The mining industry is investing. It's not like it's a completely different technology. You need to adapt it. So to me, there is a conversation to be had there with the industry to see, and that's what I was talking earlier about, new social investments. Those social investments are not pet projects like let's build a hospital and a school. It's how do I use some of my technology and invest the same or some of the same. When I buy drones, I can buy, I'm just giving an anecdotal evidence like that. I'm buying drones for myself. Maybe there are a bunch of drones that I can buy in partnership with whatever cooperative somewhere there, because we think this can be used for whatever other economic project. And that's where I think there is a scope to mutualize opportunities across economic sectors, so that you do this alternative livelihood in a sustainable manner.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Isabel. Thanks. Yeah, and to piggyback off a couple of things you said, and to tie in an earlier notion, this idea that automation will reduce the number of jobs. It will reduce a certain number of jobs, no doubt, inside the mine operationally, that have to do with taking the ore out of the ground. There's all kinds of other systems that will need to be, people will need to be trained on them. This technology and the knowledge can stay local. Drones are actually a great example. You can teach somebody to fly a drone in a couple of days, and all of a sudden they're using a GIS, geographic program systems program to start to create some of that interface we've talked about. So I tend to be on the optimistic side of that as a technologist. Maybe it's incumbent upon me to do that, but I do think that if we think about it in terms of opportunity, creating jobs, leaving knowledge and technology local, that could be a positive in our future. And I am optimistic about that. And then I'll say, without getting into the myriad kind of technology examples, I really think about it in terms of 3 or 4 categories. So there's internal data. The mines and the communities, for that matter, have all kinds of data on hand. It might be paper records, it might be stored in whatever format, but that's there, right? So we can start on a basic what exists already level. And we add some of this open source data. So that's 2, freely available data sets from World Bank or any of the institutions or great academic sources out there. You start to think about social sources, social media, SMS texts, surveys, these kinds of things. And then you think about the new stuff, right? Satellite, IoT sensors, GPS. So there's 4 categories, right? And anything in those 4 categories, we really believe, and we're kind of working on all of them to put them on our map. Anything that connects the community to that enterprise. So, we might have a chief risk officer sitting in Denver or Manhattan, and we have some community stakeholder engagement in Lima maybe, and then we have the asset itself. Well, these are spread out touch points and nodes in this network. So if that IoT sensor can show that the water pH is right, and the community agrees that the water is clean, how beautiful would that be that we can verify that ground truth, create some social license, try to create that buy-in, and then hopefully leave that labor and that knowledge and that technology local, right? Like we're talking about. So I think that's really our framework. And, a map is kind of the tool that we've decided is the thing that's, anybody knows what a map is around the world, right? Very few people don't recognize that. And so cognitively as a tool, that's what we've kind of settled on as the way we're going to bring all this info together, and what form that takes, whether it's, you know, posters in the, you know, the town square, the community center, or, you know, a very advanced kind of dashboard for our mining operators with some artificial intelligence in there. We'll see, but anything that in there that connects end to end to create that empathic space is really what we're about.
Can I add something? I was going to say, let's not forget about what the so-called old technologies, because when you are in a developing country, whatever 3G, 4G makes brilliant sense for a community that has no access at all. I think, to me, there is a secondhand market that is completely unexplored. I was talking to this, you know, if somebody has a brilliant, has money, doesn't know what to do, we've got some ideas on how to make them get rich. We develop with those secondhand technologies. Because I was talking to somebody who used to work for a mining company at some point in time, and we're talking about, you know, what do you do with everything that is being removed because you're installing completely new things? Well, of course, not everything can be, you know, reused, but some of those technologies can actually be sold for cheap. We were talking about something very simple as trucks. Trucks, if you put in, we're not talking about those 3-ton trucks, right, that you have in Pilbara. No, we're talking about the mid-sized trucks. And that guy was telling me that in countries like South Africa, for example, in communities where the waste is not being collected just because there's no infrastructure, those trucks are sitting somewhere rotting because nobody wants to take them away. And he said, you know, the mining industry is even ready to pay you to take away that waste. So we shouldn't forget about that secondhand market of some of those technologies. Somebody has to sit and think about we're looking at what's coming. We're not looking at what is become redundant, so to speak, because the new things are coming. And I'm sure we can unpack a lot out of that.
Yeah, Isabel, you really have my wheels turning. I mean, as Flaviana said earlier, you know, the radio piece, right? Radio dominates still in most of the world. And so I'm even thinking of service level businesses where you could have social license and environmental services and advocates that are jumping on the radio, disseminating information to the community. And I will, you know, add a gender-based note as the only man on the panel here, is that, you know, I think if we look at social license and some of the environmental grievance pieces, you know, if we don't know how many women are in the workforce, then we definitely don't know the, you know, perceptual and behavioral effects that women have for social license and environmental grievances that drive those license. And, you know, there's been some really interesting research, especially coming out of places like the Middle East, that show what we know about those networks on the outside from our perspective is completely different than what's on the ground. And you know, women wind up being the decision makers and some of those focus nodes that really need to go in that network to achieve social license. So information like that and trying to provide a service level business that incorporates, you know, both that environmental, social, and, you know, even a gender lens, I think would be really, really great. You know, I mean, it's unexplored. It's totally a blue ocean strategy. And I agree with you, those that take the risk to invest in these kinds of technologies, given the fact that mining's not going away anytime soon, is that's a great opportunity out there. So.
Thank you both so much. In the last few minutes of this panel, as we go into your closing thoughts, I'd love to know if you have anything else you would like to share in response to your co-panelists. And in particular, if you have any closing thoughts about how companies can better use technology to serve communities through the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, I think I'll combine both, because both Trevor and Flaviano kind of really touched on the tech side of things. I'm more from a policy side of things, even if we see, you know, what are the opportunities that technology can bring to governments in particular. It's not just only government, it's the collaboration between governments, industry, and communities. To me, this is really the sort of triple helix thing that we have to look at. It's really important. And there, I think, to me, this is really new thinking. If we can bring this back to the decision-making table, because we've seen in the climate space how investors are telling to mining companies, or any companies for that matter, well, if you are not clean, we're not going to put money on your in your business. Even companies like BlackRock has said, if you don't tick the ESG boxes, we're not going to invest in you. So Anglo is divesting from coal. Everybody's running away from fossil fuels, basically because that's what the market is saying. Now, the new generation of investors that we have today, the millennials, those who are like in their 30s and 40s, they don't want to invest in anything that is not sustainable. And sustainable with a big S, we're talking about essentially sustainability there, and how technology can serve sustainability of companies, sustainability of businesses, and sustainability of governments. Because at the end of the day, if none of that work, you have people in the street, riots, and that's it. So I think, to me, it is really important to bring all those together and make sure that the conversation that is happening at the tech side not only includes community at the core of it, but that the government has to understand what is coming. To me, those who hold the regulatory pen could be the most dangerous. I'm trying to find a better word, but they are the one who are going to regulate tomorrow, and who are going to tell companies what to do and what not to do when they come. And if they are not convinced and they are not able to provide the right framework, because that's the whole thing. We were looking at countries to try to see how we can help them with new kind of supply chains, which will be different from the kind of supply chains today. The first thing that struck us, the IP, the intangibles, the new technology is full of all those intangibles. Nobody would invest in your country if you don't have an intellectual property right framework in the first place. People are not able to patent their innovation. You don't invest in R&D. So look at the number that the governments invest in R&D in developing countries. It's very low compared to China and the others, So that aspect of the regulatory framework is still very much far behind where the industry is, and let alone where the tech geeks are, which is I even find sometimes the mining industry very much backwards compared to many other sectors when it comes to tech. So now if you want to rank them, governments is really, really far behind. And to me, we really need to make sure that this kind of convergence happen, because otherwise the sustainability with a big S is completely at risk.
Yeah, absolutely. I just could not agree more, or could have said it better myself. I mean, I think we have an opportunity right now in the timing of things, because we're getting industry to catch up. We're getting regulatory frameworks to catch up. Now is really the time to develop this stuff, especially in terms of the tech enablement piece. One thing I will say is that as those millennial investors think about how to divest, right, from things that they don't consider clean, one paradox you'll find is that, as we reduce fossil fuel use, we really need more minerals, right? Because we're building more lithium batteries, we're building more solar panels. The battery technology has to advance. So you find yourself in this situation where may be good for everybody on the panel, but mining's not going away in our lifetime, and we need to achieve these social license and environmental standards. So it's refreshing, I think, just to meet everybody here, just that we're all working on this and kind of trying to attack this very specific problem, and yet one that, especially with social license and climate, extends to all kinds of other things. And you mentioned riots in the streets. When governments and enterprise lose their social license, it really is a lose-lose, right? We want to create clean, sustainable, dignified buy-in to some of these activities that we know we're going to need. And that's just going to be a win-win for everybody. So I feel lucky to work on it, and it's refreshing to meet everybody on the panel, including Flaviano. I'm just looking forward to kind of pursuing these things. Isabel, I can't wait to follow up with you afterward and talk about your research too, because I would love to implement some of these things in more of a institutionalized way into our technology.
Yeah, and I can put you through to some of our partners on the ground. We work with, organizations that facilitate dialogue with communities in many countries. and they'll be thrilled to work with people like you.
I always say it's just a pretty map unless we're talking to people on the ground about what's happening with stakeholders and environmental and social concerns. So thank you very much. We'd love that.
Thank
And
you.
thanks,
so
Christy
much.
and Ashley, for putting us all on the call.
It's such a pleasure. And I think, like other panels today, this panel really underlies the need for work across disciplines, across stakeholder groups to address the challenges of today and move into a more sustainable future. So thank you so much for your work. Participants, I really encourage you to look up the websites of our panelists today, of Source International, Links Global Intelligence. Go to igfmining.org. And at the beginning of this panel, Isabel referenced the IGF's annual general meeting, which is really a great space for understanding key topics across stakeholder groups and hearing from your counterparts really innovative strategies to advance sustainable development. Isabel, do we have a date set for 2021 for the AGM?
It will all depend on COVID. Normally it's in October. We don't have a date yet because it depends on our UNCTAD partner. But the one thing I can say is that the next AGM will be a hybrid AGM where we will definitely continue with an online virtual version of it, which will allow anybody who cannot fly to the cheap city of Geneva to at least participate in the conversation. I think, that virtual platform was hard to organize, but we learned so much from how many more people we could get to the conversation just because there was no limit to the number of people who can attend. It will be in October 2021. We don't have a date yet, but so if people are interested in knowing what we do, we have a newsletter. When you connect to the website, you can join the newsletter, and at some point in time, the date will be announced.
Terrific, thank you. We're all learning together through virtual platforms and look forward to being together again in person. But thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
Thanks to all of you.
So I welcome now our panelists to join us. Flaviano Bianchini, who is in Pisa, where it's almost midnight. So we really appreciate him if he's still up joining us. Also, Trevor Jones with Links Global Intelligence. And Isabel is not able to join us at this late hour in Paris, where she's based, but we're so pleased to have on Aaron Cosby, who will be sharing his experience from the Intergovernmental Forum, and also as co-director with Isabel of the New Tech New Deal project. So for this Q&A session, just for the next 20 minutes or so, I'll ask Cassie and Melissa to turn their videos off, unless you want to interject with a comment or question, which we welcome. So welcome, Aaron, to our panel. We're so glad to have you here. And I thought, since you weren't part of those conversations, we might start with you, giving us just some reactions to this discussion and anything that came up about the New Tech New Deal project that you might want to add a bit of your comments to. Thanks for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me. Isabel, given that she lives in Paris, sends her regrets, but she's asleep right now, and I'll try my best to fill those rather big boots. So it's been a rich discussion. I'm not sure what to add, other than from our perspective, there's this whole suite of new technologies that's coming down the pipeline in the mining sector, drawn from other applications. You've got cheap sensors, you've got GIS, you've got artificial intelligence, you got blockchain, machine learning, and then systems that optimize all of those to fine-tune performance at the mine site. And you know, as has been said, the final impact of all of those is amazing. You've got a more efficient process. You're able to access and exploit grades that you couldn't under conventional technologies. You've probably got lower greenhouse gas emissions because of optimized operation of equipment. You've probably got better opportunities for women in mining, and you guys explored that to some extent. But you also have probably significantly fewer workers, and there are few technologies that lead to that result, including autonomous vehicles, autonomous blasting and drilling, drones, these sorts of things. And so our job, as Isabel outlined it, has been to try to think about what kinds of, let me back up. This kind of destroys the balance of benefits and costs from a host government and a host community's perspective, given that from a host community's perspective, your major benefit by far is direct employment and indirect and induced employment. It's also the biggest contribution from a national level. It far outweighs taxes, it outweighs royalties, it outweighs procurement, right? So if you're lowering that at the same time as you're keeping everything else constant, the deal is unbalanced. And our search has been to try to figure out what can add more balance to that deal. And part of it, of course, as we've said, is better environmental impact. Part of it is using those technologies to give more information, direct real-time information to local community members about those environmental impacts. You know, you build a better trust relationship. It's not seen so much as a damaging exploitive activity to mine in their community. Part of it may lie in new forms of taxation and royalties, but you know, that's a poor substitute for a number of reasons. That's a poor substitute for direct employment. Part of it is shared infrastructure and technologies like internet, broadband internet brought to the communities, and part of it may be, you know, full-scale development spending, community development efforts that have nothing to do with mining, focused on, for example, exploitation of agriculture or fostering of entrepreneurship in the local communities, things that add value to the community and that mining can help facilitate in a number of ways, but really has not that much direct relationship to the mining activity. But the bottom line message is there really is no silver bullet here. There's no perfect replacement for the kind of beneficial impacts you get from employing 14,000 people at a mine operation when it's retrofitted and goes down to 500, right? So, you know, we're working on it.
So we don't have the full picture, but what would you see as the next most immediate step, whether it's research oriented or action oriented or some combination?
Well, in terms of research, we need to understand better what the new mines look like. So there's still a debate. Every conference you go to talks about no net job loss. There's still a debate about whether there will actually be net job losses as a result of the new technologies. So we don't know. The new mines, the fully automated mines, have just come on stream in the last few years, although we've had autonomous trucks for almost a decade now in the Pilbara. So there's plenty of research that we need to do to understand those impacts, to understand the profitability, because it's easy to say they're making more profit because they're automated, they're more efficient. So let's tax them to a much greater degree, and that will, well, we don't know that they're making more profit. We don't know that if they are, it will be a sustained and significant level of increased profits. It may become just what you have to do in order to survive as a mining company. So there's a lot we don't know yet, and that's the research side of it. In terms of action, you know, we've been working with people like ICMM and ILO to try to think about, you know, one of the obvious solutions is if you've got less jobs, but you do have some jobs that are better jobs, let's try to upskill or reskill the local workers or at least nationals to take those jobs. And so there's an obvious focus here on skills training, and it has to be a partnership between national governments, vocational, educational institutions, mining companies, the local communities. So we're working with a number of partners on trying to understand where the opportunities lie for actual action that tries to take advantage of that obvious path. Although, of course, it's not the ultimate solution, but it's, as I say, an obvious one.
Thank you, Aaron. And for those of you who are still waiting our alphabet soup, ICMM is the International Council on Mining and Metals, and ILO is the International Labor Organization. So those may certainly come up again in our conversation. So likewise, Flaviano, and thank you so much for staying up so late for us. We really appreciate having you here live. I wonder your reaction to your co-panelists, Isabel and Trevor, and anything else you'd like to add before we move to our participant questions.
Well, maybe something to add to the loss of job that Aaron was mentioning is that there is also a there is a loss of job in the new mines, but I think there might be opportunity to new kind of job in the way of more an environmentally sustainable mine. So I mean, I'm thinking about recycling, reuse materials, monitoring, environmental monitoring, and all the aspect of social monitoring and human rights monitoring. So obviously those will never be the same amount of jobs of the old mines. As Aaron mentioned, I mean, old mines used to employ 10,000 of employees. I mean, those are not the same number and the same scale, but at the same time, I think there is also some new jobs that are emerging with new mines too.
Thank you. So I'll go to our first question from a participant, Ernest. Should technology complement or replace face-to-face communication? Flaviano, do you want to respond to this first?
Yes, I mean, I think it can integrate it, and I hope it will not. To be honest, that's more than it's more a hope than a real thinking. But I think it will be an integration to the face-to-face communication, but I don't think they will 100% substitute it. I don't know if it's a thinking or a hope, but probably both.
Trevor.
Yeah, you know, I think they have to be complementary. I think what we're finding is that, you know, obtaining source information from communities is quite difficult. And so technology tools that could enhance that would be great. But, you know, as Flaviano mentioned, he was having great success, you know, going in country to train on different devices and that kind of thing. So really has to be complementary. I don't think we're ever going to get away from human face-to-face interaction, though, in that environment, purely speaking.
I might add something. Sorry, I'm a bit slow. You know, it's kind of late. I think that there is a good aspect of actually the digital communication is the anonymous and the fact that it can be anonymous. You know, in a lot of cases, especially, you know, when there is a conflict between a mine and a community, and especially in certain environments, for example, Latin America, where the conflictivity can be very high and the risk can be very high for community member. I mean, in some of our realities, if a community, I mean, we have been speaking with community members like hidden in the dark, you know, because they are afraid from that people from the mining company or the government could see them. Mm-hmm. So in that case, I think digital communication, and especially if it can be anonymous, it can help, at least to know the fact and the data that otherwise you won't have access to.
Anything you'd like to add, Aaron?
I don't know what I could add to those two excellent answers. It's a question, obviously, that goes beyond the mining sector, right? And I know that for some of our research, the inability to actually go to mine site and talk to people has been a problem, right? People are willing to say things to you. You know, this is the flip side of what Flaviano was saying. If we're talking to mine site operators, they're willing to tell me something if I'm sitting down with them face to face that they wouldn't tell me in a recorded session or in an email. This again it's a question that goes beyond the mining sector. I'm just talking about it from our specific research perspective.
Right. And I mean, I think in any interpersonal relationship, there's such an extraordinary value of having interaction in a less formal setting than we're sharing here today, where you really get to know each other. And I think it's a big component to building trust and building genuine relationships that is really needed in the mining sector. But particularly through the COVID era, we see where in areas, which is most of the world right now, where we don't want to spread the pandemic and we're trying to contain, increase uptake of some technologies. But I don't see technology completely replacing face-to-face communication in my lifetime, because interpersonal, in-person relationships are so extremely valuable, and I don't think we can replace that entirely. But we are thankful that we have these tools that we've shared in the panel that we can use in the COVID era to complement the relationship building that needs to be maintained. So the second question, also excellent, is from Kylene Barons, a mining engineering student who is researching and working on artisanal and small scale mining issues. And she's curious how artisanal and small scale mining can play a role in sustainable development and responsible sourcing. As grades decline, supply chain transparency is encouraged, and this sector becomes more significant. But how can we design a route for integrating technology and knowledge into the ASM sector to meet the demand for responsibly mined minerals?
Yeah, and let me identify Kalen here too, because he's actually a guy. So so Kalen, we'll have to make that clear for you.
Thank you. I think the New Tech New Deal project is focused on larger scale mines, but may have some insights. I know IGF has completed a guidance document on the topic of artisanal and small scale mining. So maybe Aaron, we'll start with any comments you may have.
Sure, and I'll start with the caveat that I'm not an expert on ASM, but that's never stopped me from pronouncing before, so it won't now either. We've done some work. We've done a lot of work at IGF on ASM. We've done some work within the context of our work, look at new technology on ASM as well. And for me, it's a really interesting and under-researched set of questions. So if we are talking about a mining environment in which the big players are becoming more and more efficient, number one, are we talking about tougher conditions of competition for ASM operators? Are we forcing them to even thinner margins of profitability? Number two, if we're talking about thousands and thousands of people, former mining workers laid off in mining affected communities, do we then create a wave of new ASM operators who have nothing else to do, who have no other economic alternatives, but have some mining skills, who then go out into the field? And number three, and this gets to the question that Caleb posed, or one of the questions Caleb posed, what do you do to try to bring the benefits of new technology to ASM scale operations? Because you know, the fundamental problem with these kinds of operations is they don't really want to be reached or cataloged or you know, usually mainstreamed, but those are the prerequisites to any kind of a program of trying to push out new technologies to them and push out extension services, capacity building on, you know, even if we had the technology tomorrow, the challenge would be actually getting it into the hands of these guys, people, number one, getting the level of trust from them that this technology works, because they're operating on razor thin margins. They don't have a lot of capital to invest in new machinery when the stuff they've got is already working. All right. And thirdly, getting them together in some organized fashion at all to try to make a push to get this technology out there. So I mean, it's the nature of ASM that it's a really hard beast to wrestle with, precisely because of the disseminated and ephemeral nature of the operation.
Well, SDSG is working with Colorado School of Mines and a Peruvian-based organization called Futuro Sostenible and a network of other researchers right now in a 3-year research study of gold supply chains in Peru, and illicit. And we're learning a lot about this topic and looking also at some of the innovations and finding that this era of COVID-19 is also an opportunity to bring on new technologies as ASM has slowed in some areas, ramped up in others. But there's a window, as we see it, to work with stakeholders now to integrate technologies, for example, that will reduce or eliminate use of mercury to meet the objectives of the Minamata Convention on Mercury, to stop use of cyanide, and to promote uptake of viable alternatives. And one reason for this is economic more than technological, because with closed borders and decreased avenues for licit and illicit trade within countries, it's more difficult to access those chemicals. So having a lower cost, immediate access to an alternative is more possible now, using new technologies, new methods. Ashley, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I just wanted to say that, interestingly, COVID is actually presenting a really good opportunity for ASM to become more integrated, especially when we're looking at these technologies and increasing community engagement in these times. As Christy mentioned, in some places, ASM has been really staunched by COVID and supply chains have been blocked and other difficulties have arisen. But at the same time, governments and companies and other stakeholders have almost doubled down on their commitment to ensuring that ASM production becomes an integral part of the mineral supply chain. We also see governments recommitting to things like the OECD due diligence guidelines for responsible supply chain management. And there's a chapter on ASM in that. And so COVID, although it has been presenting lots of challenges for ASM and the supply chain, it's also really created an opportunity for governments and companies and other stakeholders to think of really important ways to make sure that ASM is brought more into the legal frameworks and brought more into the fold. So that's been a really interesting trend to watch, and it should be interesting to see how that progresses over the next few years.
Thank you, Ashley.
Yes.
I think a sensible issue with ASM is also awareness of the ASM themselves. I mean, you were mentioning mercury before, and with mercury, I mean, the main issue is that they poison themselves, but they don't know. And I mean, we see thousands of people in Africa and Asia and also South America that literally kill themselves slowly with mercury, and they don't know that they are doing it. So I think first an environmental issue is a health issue, but there is a lack of awareness, so people don't know that what is happening to their health. So I think that's a big issue that should be tackled as first.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that for a second.
Trevor, just go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So sorry for the delay there, but Flaviano, to piggyback on that, the awareness, and then just the the knowledge about where these operations are. So if you look at an environment like southern Venezuela, for example, a lot of illicit artisanal mining, devastating effects for the environment and society, and then also below the smelter level in the region. A lot of multinationals, that are using some of these minerals just don't even know kind of where they're coming from. So just the education, the awareness, and the geolocation perhaps of where this activity is happening is crucial. And then also, as Christy alluded to, both the legal and the illicit piece too. I mean, those have different kind of implications. And to the question, what is possible in terms of implementing those technologies? Obviously some of the covert or hidden sites in an environment like Venezuela is going to be a little bit more difficult than somewhere like Peru, but completely necessary all the same across the supply chain there.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Caitlin, for the great question. And we hope that you start working on some new technologies for ASM. So I'll turn the floor over to John. I will welcome our panelists all to stay on as you're able. For the next 25 minutes, we will take any questions on the topics that have arisen today, any comments from participants. So keep using the Q&A thread. If there's anything you didn't get to ask, any remaining questions that you have. But thank you so much, Aaron, Flaviano, Trevor, Isabel, for a wonderful, engaging panel.
Yeah,
Thank you for having
you
us.
all.
Thank you.
It's really been terrific today, and I really appreciate all of the contributions you've made, and thank you particularly, Christy, for putting together some fantastic panels for us. I think that we can open up the floor for any questions or comments. And I see Cassie, you can and Mel, you can put your pictures back on here if you're still available to participate. Mary Polton, are you available right now? I see your.
I am
there
here.
You are. Do you have any observations, Mary, based on what we've gone through today?
Well, I think if we wanted to reinforce to everybody just how fiendishly complex it is to produce the very large, diverse number of elements that we now find vital to our existence, today really brought that home to everybody. I mean, there's the whole technology challenge of finding and producing these elements wherever they exist, but all of the environmental, social, and governance issues as well just really make it clear that producing anything at low cost is a miracle of sorts. And I will tell you, I wish people would put a nickel in the jar every time they said clean or green or renewable, because these technology minerals that are the enablers for all of these, quote, clean things and green things and renewable things, have a set of challenges that most people really don't want to address. And certainly there's a big disconnect on the policy side, in my opinion, between.
Yeah, I think that one thing that Dave said really struck me was the amount of carbon dioxide that's created by the production of a lot of our new green metals or minerals. And so it's to the extent that we're trying to eliminate the carbon footprint, we have a major problem in carbon sequestration, and maybe that we start looking for new uses of carbon dioxide. People are going to have to start drinking a lot more soda water. But really, the floor is open for any comments that any of you have.
I'll jump in and thank you again, John, for having us. And thank you to Ashley as well for co-facilitating all of the panels that we led for today. So one question that is certainly not a new question, but continues to come up in conversations that we have with stakeholders is in the process of promoting benefit sharing and development projects with communities. Where does the line begin and end between the obligation of companies to promote community development and the obligation for governments to promote community development and advance toward the sustainable development goals? You know, we often work through multi-stakeholder initiatives as one avenue to address those issues, but I'd love to hear everyone's expert opinions based on your experience on this age-old topic that is ongoing.
Well, I'll jump in since somebody has to go first. It's a real challenge for companies to strike the right balance, because the fear always is we're not there to replace the government. We're not there to resolve problems that are inherent in some countries due to poor governance. So, you know, where corruption exists and, you know, taxes have been paid, but the government then is not providing services, companies frequently find themselves caught in the middle because there are always trust issues, right? And the population doesn't necessarily trust government, but they also don't necessarily trust the company. So even when the company takes the step, for instance, of publishing what it has paid to the government in taxes to demonstrate that it is adhering to law and to expected norms and doing its part, that doesn't necessarily assuage a community that is not prospering because they don't have clean water and they don't have electricity and they don't have good schools, et cetera, et cetera. And like any human being, their response pretty much is, well, somebody needs to be providing this and you're right here. Mm-hmm. So very, very touchy situation for companies.
Yeah, that really is a valid point, Mel. And I think that so many of the agreements that companies will try to come up with, a lot of the financial result of the mining flows to the central government, and that there's not enough of it coming back to the local community. So I think in some respects is part of the cost of doing business in a lot of these countries is to as part of the initial investment to work on establishing schools and hospitals and healthcare systems coming out of the box to be able to provide a little bit more negotiating room with the central government in what the ultimate taxation or royalties are going to be.
Where
Yeah.
a company builds a hospital or a school, how do we effectively transition ongoing services that will last beyond the life of the mine? And maybe Cassie, you have some examples of this. Or your own ideas.
Well, I think it's a really, as Mel said, it's such a challenge, even for the best companies to figure out how to transition those services. But I think a lot of companies have realized that simply putting money into bricks and mortars is really only half the issue. And if you're not building capacity or building partnerships, either with the government to ensure, when you're negotiating your mineral concessions with the government, to say, well, really, a portion of this, we want to go back, these revenues or royalties need to go back directly to the local government or that kind of thing. But I think increasingly, companies are looking at trying to establish local community trusts. That's part of it, give them some money, but then you really have to build the capacity and governance structure to ensure that you're able to manage those funds over the course of the company and after the company leaves. And that's nothing so brilliant on my part to say, and there are examples where it's kind of worked, but I'm a big believer that companies need to spend more time and effort in capacity building and the IGF, and there's lots of organizations, Christy, including you guys, that it's about building capacity first in order to handle sort of what other buildings or resources then the company is going to give to the community or provide the community with.
Yeah, and in order to do that, lots of companies partner aggressively with NGOs. I mean, I know in Africa, we worked with PACT, we worked with all kinds of NGOs in order to do exactly that, to build the capacity. The complication becomes, coming back, Christy, to the idea of bricks and mortar, the problem becomes, so the company built the hospital and the company funded the NGO to help train the local doctors, nurses, clinicians, etc. That's all fine and dandy. But then when the mine closes in 25 more years, it still needs money. And as long as governments aren't stepping up and doing their civic duty and actually, providing the money for these things to continue, they can't continue. That's where the tragedy lies, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I mean, one way that we look at this issue also is through mine closure planning and the idea of really integrating in a much deeper way the social and economic transitions that a community undergoes at the time of mine closure. We learn every day we can't look at environmental issues in isolation because these opportunities and issues that we face are so interconnected. But I wonder, Cassie, Melissa, and anyone else who might have thoughts on this, have you seen examples of use of a mine closure plan to address these issues? And do you think that might be a good approach?
I can't speak to any examples that I know of, although I think because most of the projects I'm thinking of are still ongoing and they will be for years, but I think that's good. I do think too, when I think about some of the communities that there really has been an effort to help these local communities create businesses that in some cases support the mine, but actually have a bigger ability to expand their business beyond the mine, whether it's food production, and then you help them with transportation and getting a bigger market. I think that I've seen in places where it's successful after the mine starts to close. But I agree with you. I think making the mine think about that as a component of their shutdown plan makes a lot of sense.
Well, and I'm going to say I think it's a good idea because it was part of what I said earlier, that the so-called soft elements need to be incorporated from the time that the company first begins to look at a country all the way through to how are we going to leave that country. So I'm obviously going to say I agree with you. I'm not sure that that takes place right now, or at least not fully. So I can think of lots of examples where companies have developed and indeed implemented wonderful, environmental remediation plans, but not necessarily with any social flow through.
We do have a very good question that has been posed to us and directed to all the panelists from Kirst Kingsbury. And says, do you have any advice for students such as myself, Kayleen and Max, as to things we can do now to better develop ourselves so that we can continue to make the mining industry more sustainable throughout our careers? And it really is a good observation on our classic mining education that has been focused a lot on the engineering elements, and it's I think that it is courses such as the sustainable development courses that we're working on really in many areas, and Mary, do you have any thoughts on this particular question?
What I have told students that I was advising is that mining, unlike almost any other engineering major, requires you to have a much broader knowledge base. And so don't waste your time on Facebook and Twitter. Read things like The Economist. Push yourself to understand history, understand culture, understand politics, and understand that our perspective in the US is not the way the rest of the world operates in many of these places. And so, it's just incumbent on you to be that more knowledgeable, well-rounded, curious person. And don't necessarily just look for this coming from the classroom, but go out and educate yourself and broaden the circle of people that you talk to and listen to.
Absolutely. I agree completely with Mary. And my advice to students is a 4-factor approach that applies in the COVID era, in any era, is to get involved, really start participating in initiatives on topics that you care about, to get connected, learn about experts who are doing this work in the field. If you can't meet with them in person, ask them to join you for a Zoom meeting or a phone call, and to really get engaged through internships and externship opportunities. As a student, and particularly in this era, whether you're working in person or remotely, you have a really unique opportunity to position yourself as free talent for a company that you want to work for someday, an NGO you want to work with. And finally, to get published, like use this time, especially as we're in our homes and offices more, and not able to travel as much in some cases, to really deeply research a topic that's fascinating to you and publish on it. And this will help you a lot to move forward in your career and gain more than a surface level knowledge of topics you care about.
Do you have anyone else can jump in on any other contributions that you'd like to make on the general topic that we've been addressing today. And I don't want to force you. I know it's been a long day for some of us, and it's really been a lot of fun. And I think that these topics are rarely fully developed in as we have tried to do today. Mel, I see that you have unmuted yourself. You have. Would you like to jump in?
No, I just had a thought because I'm looking at the screen and I'm seeing female faces, but the industry continues to confront the problem of not being particularly attractive to women. And yet we desperately need more female leadership in the industry to complement the male leadership, because it truly is two completely different leadership dynamics and leadership skills that are brought to the table. And I sometimes think to myself that perhaps we have trouble getting more women involved because of the systemic approach that says the soft side stuff isn't so important after all. And women tend to be affiliated with soft side stuff. But whatever the cause, in some countries it's cultural. I remember very well when we were in Congo starting to look at building the mine, and I was pushing to recruit women locally for jobs besides cleaning. And one of the tribal chiefs in a small village looked me right in the eye and said, "Madam, no woman in my village is going to be allowed to work under the ground in a mine with men." And I looked at him and I said, "Really? Have you asked them? Because we're ready to hire them."
Yeah,
but it just goes to the point that in some times and places, it's a cultural impediment as well that it's hard for companies to overcome. I don't want to lay the entire burden on companies. It's also culture sometimes.
Yeah, and of course, in many respects, we have to start somewhere too. And I was always impressed with the idea that the major mining companies were hiring women as truck drivers for their large trucks, and finding out that the women were much better drivers than the men, because obviously they were probably more careful in getting their job done. But it's a good comment too, because I was noting that in the panelists that we have today, that we've had a lot more women, and I think that I will note that Mary Polton was the first woman to manage an engineering program at the University of Arizona. So Mary's a pathfinder in herself. Any other thoughts? And and maybe that's is a good note to finish up on too, because I will say that Mary has been a partner with me in the construction of the Global Mining Center at the University of Arizona, because I think that you'll note that the co-sponsors of this program are the law school and the Department of Mining and Geological Engineering, and I'm really very proud of that.
No, thanks,
Any other
John.
thoughts?
And I think it's a great association to have this global mining law program. I think we're extremely proud of it.
Well, thank you, Mary. And really, with that, I thank all the panelists.
Thank you, John. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Christy. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Thank you very much.